Companies usually raise funds through two main sources. One is to issue new shares, and the second method is to raise funds through issuing bonds. So bonds are actually debt instruments. When a company wants to borrow, they may issue bonds, and then they sell these bonds in the market, and then they raise funds for their future projects, for their growth, or other purposes. The government also may issue bonds. So bonds are just debt instruments that the issuer, which can be a company, the government, they prepare and sell it in the market, and by selling it, they will receive money. So these, they will use this money for their projects or their business. So let me show you how it works. So basically, there are two parties. So one is the issuer of the bond. Issuer of the bonds. And the issuer of the bond, they will prepare the, so it's like a contract, it's an instrument. It's a financial instrument. So it's like a contract, and they will prepare this contract, and so this is bond. And they sell this contract in the market to the investors. So this is the buyer of the bond. Buyer of the bond, issuer or seller of the bond. And so the issuer issue the bonds to raise funds. So the buyer buy the bond. In other words, the buyer is lending money. So they lend money to the issuer. So the issuer is borrowing money. So they borrow money. So the buyer needs to pay money to the issuer or borrower to receive this bond or debt instrument. There are certain things mentioned in the bond contract or this instrument. Of course, one is the name of the issuer. It can be a company or it can be the government. And then there are a few other things. One is called par value, or we name it face value. So let me write face value here. Face value or par value. This is the principle. And for corporate bonds, in most cases, this is $1,000. In most cases, this is for corporate bonds is $1,000. This means that at the end of the maturity, the issuer needs to pay the borrower. Sorry, the issuer or borrower needs to pay to the investor $1,000. So here I add one more thing: invest, or we can call it investors who lend money, right? So lend money. Anyway, so one thing mentioned on the contract is face value or par value. So the par value is fixed, and in most cases for corporate bonds is $1,000. Then another thing is time to maturity, or let's say maturity. means how long is the life of this bond. It can be 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, even can be just maybe a few days. But for bonds, the longest it has been issued so far, I think it has been issued by Coca-Cola, and it's 100 years. But it's not very common to issue very long-term bonds. So maturity means how long is the life of this instrument, for how long the borrower wants to borrow money from the investor. Another thing mentioned on the contract or on the instrument is coupon rate. Coupon rate means that how the interest that the borrower needs to pay to the investor. Because the borrower is borrowing money, so they need to pay interest to the lender. So it's a fixed interest mentioned on the bond instrument, and it's always a percentage of par value. For example, if the coupon rate is 5%, this means it's 5% of $1,000, means $50. In other words, the borrower needs to pay $50 every year to the investor. So it's a fixed interest that the borrower needs to pay to the investor, because the borrower is borrowing money, so the borrower needs to pay fixed interest. So this is another thing mentioned on the contract. So another one is whether this bond is the payment is per year or per 6 months or quarterly. For corporate bonds, most of them are semi-annually, but it can be maybe annual or maybe even different forms, but they need to mention this. But in most cases, it can be, the payment can be per year or semi-annual. It means every 6 months, the payment of the coupon. So these will be mentioned on the contract. So the borrower or issuer prepared this contract and sells in the market. An investor can buy this, means he will pay, the person will pay money to the issuer and will collect this, will take this, will buy this. And then later, based on the terms mentioned here in the contract, the issuer needs to pay to the investor coupon, means the fixed payment every year or every 6 months. And then at the maturity, at the end of the contract, the borrower needs to pay face value to the investor, which, as I said, for corporate bonds is usually $1,000. So based on this, let's draw the timeline. Then it will be easier for us to do the calculation and compute the bond price and construct the formula. So based on my explanation, the timeline will be something like this. This is today. This is the maturity. Let's say N. So suppose the N-year bond, 5-year, 10 years bond. And then we have T1, T2, and it goes to Tn. And let's say it's annual, so they pay per year. The coupons are paid per year. So suppose that these are years and the payment will be made per year. So what's the payment? Is the coupon. So the coupon will be paid every year until the maturity. And then at the end of the maturity, par value or face value will be paid to the investor as well. So this is the timeline. So as you can see, it's the fixed payment, the coupon, every period, or if it's annual case, every year. And then at the maturity, the par value will be paid to the investor. And that's all. This is the end of the story. So now we want to know what's the price of this instrument. Suppose you are an investor and you go to the market and you want to invest or you want to buy bonds. So how you determine the price? You need to know what are the future cash flows, and then you discount them to the present time. This is the common method, most common methods to to compute the price of most of the instruments in finance, most of the financial instruments. So actually there is no new formula we want to use here, although if you look at your textbook you will see, oh, there is a new formula, but actually that formula is derived from the formulas that you already have learned. So the method we use is cash flow method to compute the price of this instrument. This means that we need to first identify the future cash flows. We will use the same method later for computing the stock price. So the first step is to compute, to estimate, to identify the future cash flows. Then we need to discount those cash flows to the present time at the interest rate or required rate of return that we have determined, and then this is the price. So here, how can we compute the present value of these future cash flows? One way is to discount them one by one. So we have some cash flows for n years, C, and then par value. We discount them one by one. Another method is, as here we have the same cash flow, C, for limited number of years, we can use annuity formula. You remember annuity is used when you have the same cash flow for limited number of periods. And here we have the same cash flows for n years or n periods, right? So we can use annuity formula. And then we have one single cash flow, which is par value, and we discount this to the present time separately and add it to it. So let's compute the present value of these cash flows. So present value is the discounted value of these C's, these cash flows, which are the same for limited number of periods. So it's annuity. And the formula for annuity is cash flow multiplied by 1 minus 1 plus R power n divided by R. So this represents all these C's, and it discounts them to the present time. Plus, we haven't discounted the par value yet, so I discount this one to the present time separately. Plus par value, or face value, is another name for par value, divided by 1 plus R. For how many periods? N periods. What is this? This is the formula that you already have seen, the discounting formula. You remember present value is future value over 1 plus R power n. It's the same formula, right? So we discounted all future cash flows to the present time. And this is the price of the bond. So I can name this price. Current price of the bond. Because in finance, this is one of the most common methods. I told you that to compute the price of an instrument, we identify the future cash flows. Then we discount them to the present time. And this is the price. So suppose the price that you compute is, for example, $900. Then you go to the market and you see the bond has been priced at $920. So based on your calculation, assume that the price should be $900, but you see in the market is $920. So what do? Will you buy it? No, because it's overpriced, right? It's too expensive. Based on your estimation, it should be $900, but in the market is $920. So you won't buy it. But assume that based on your calculation is $900, but in the market now it's traded at $860. So you will buy it because in the market it's cheaper than your expectation, right? So anyway, this is the way we compute the bond price. So what is C? C is the coupon payments, right? On the bond instrument, you can find coupon rate, but here is coupon payment, how much in US dollar is the payment, fixed payment on this bond. You need to compute this. How? Okay, I will summarize all these things here. Coupon rate is, C, or coupon payment is coupon rate percentage of par value, right? Coupon rate percentage of par value. Par value is usually for corporate bonds is $1,000. So it's coupon rate percentage of $1,000. So if coupon rate is 5%, so 5% of $1,000, $50. If it's 6%, 6% of $1,000 is $60. This is C, right? R is interest rate per period, not per year. So if the bond pay per year, this is per year. If the bond pay per 6 months or semi-annually, so this means that the interest rate per 6 months will be here. Actually, interest rate has another name as well in bonds. We call it yield to maturity. So this interest rate also, they has another name, yield to maturity. It's another term referring to interest rate. Okay. Next one is here, or N. N is number of periods, not number of years. Periods till maturity. So when the bond is a 10-year bond and it pays annually, means N is 10. If, for example, the bond is 5 years till maturity, but it's semi-annual, so this means 5 years until maturity, and every year 2 periods means 10. Anyway, so this is number of periods till maturity. Then we have par value there. Par value. Par value or face value is a fixed value that is mentioned on the bond instrument. And in most cases, usually, as I said, is $1,000. So if I didn't give you this in the exam, you need to assume it's $1,000. And PV, of course, is the price. It's price of the bond today. So there are 5 parameters that we need to include in the calculation of bond price. Before showing you how to use the financial calculator, I want to show you something here. As you can see, we have 4 parameters that impact price of the bond. So one is the coupon payment. One is the interest rate, number of periods till maturity, and par value. So these are the 4 parameters that impact price of the bond. Coupon is fixed, is constant. The time that the issuer issues the bond, they already have mentioned the coupon rate. So it won't change until the maturity. It's fixed. It's the fixed interest, fixed payment that the issuer will pay to the investor. So this is fixed. This won't change at all. N, number of periods till maturity. This is fixed. The time they issue the bond, it's very clearly mentioned. It's clearly mentioned that whether this is a 2-year bond, 5-year bond, 10 years bond, or 30 years bond. So this is constant. N is constant. Par value is fixed. It's already mentioned on the instrument. So on the contract or bond indenture. So for corporate bonds, as I said, it's mostly $1,000. So this $1,000 is $1,000. It won't change until the maturity that the investor will receive $1,000. So the issuer will pay $1,000, and this is the end of the contract, right? So this won't change. This won't change. It's always $1,000 if it's $1,000, right? So this N is constant, DC is constant, par value is constant, right? And yeah. So C, N, and par value are constant. So the only thing that may change is R, interest rate. R may change, right? R may change. Because interest rate in the market may change, right? Sometimes the economy is good, sometimes the economy is not good. It's maybe recession, so the interest rate, inflation interest rate will change. And as you can see here, there is a negative relationship between interest rate and price of the bond. Means by increasing interest rate, the price of the bond will go down. By reducing the interest rate, the price of the bond will go up because the R is in the denominator of the formula. So there is a negative relationship between interest rate and price. And this is the only thing, it seems, in the formula, as you can see, that impact the bond price. So those bond holders, those who buy bonds, they carefully, every day, let's say, they check the interest rate in the market. Because by increasing the interest rate, the value of their instruments will go down. By reducing the interest rate, the value of their investment, their bonds will go up. Why this happens? You can see, because you can compute it, right? There is another reason as well. Suppose today a company issues a, let's say, 10% bond. Based on the market interest rate, the company decides to issue a 10% bond. So if it's a 10% bond, this means that the company promises to pay 10% coupon every, let's say, year to the investor. So it's a fixed interest, a fixed payment that the company promises to pay to the investor, right? So when they issue the 10% bond, this means if it's a 20-year bond, for the next 20 years, the company promises, the issuer promises to pay 10% of $1,000 means $100. $100 interest fixed payment to the investor. Now, assume that a few months later, the interest rate in the market goes down to, for example, 1%. Now, what happens? The company is still paying 10% fixed interest to the investors, but actually in the market, the interest rate is 1%. So the company, the issuer of the bond is paying very high interest rate, while in the market, the interest rate has dropped to just 1%, right? So now, this contract is very valuable because a person who owns this contract, this bond, is receiving 10% interest rate, but in the market interest rate is just 1%. So it becomes very valuable. So what happens? The demand for this bond will increase. So the price of these bonds will increase. You see? Or let's assume that the same story, the company, the issuer has issued a bond that promises to pay 10% for the next 20 years. But later, the interest rate goes up in the market to 20%. So now investors are not happy because they have, the investor who already bought this bond, the investor has a bond that is paying him 10% interest, but in the market, the interest rate is 20%. So the investors don't like it because they are receiving very low interest compared with the market interest rate. So what happened? The demand for this bond will reduce. Less people are interested in this instrument, and people prefer to sell it, right? To get ready to get ready to sell it because it's paying them less than the market interest rate. So what happens? The supply, I mean, people who have this bond, the supply will increase, people want to sell it, and less people are interested to buy it. So the demand will reduce, the supply will increase. Supply in terms of those who want to sell. So what happens? The price will go down. So interest rate went up in the market, price went down. So you see, based on my explanation, there is a negative relationship between interest rate and price of the bond. And we already actually saw this in the formula. When interest rate goes up, price will go down because interest rate is in the denominator of the formula. So, so there are 5 parameters, as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that you need to include in the equation, in the formula. Always you have 4 of them and you are required to compute the 5th one, right? So sometimes I may give you the C, R, N par value and I ask you to compute the price of the bond. Sometimes I may give you, in some cases, maybe I will give you C, N, par, and PV, and I ask you to compute the yield to maturity or interest rate, right? So as long as you have 4 of them, you can compute the 5th one. And for some of them, the formula will be a bit difficult to use. For example, if I ask you to find R, it's a bit more difficult because you need to you need to be good in math to be able to solve this equation when you want to find R, right? Or you want to find N. So in these cases, I suggest you use a financial calculator. So later I will show you how to use the financial calculator to compute the bond price or maybe interest rate or N. And it's much easier than the formula, but you need to have a very good understanding of the formula. Okay, let's get back to our example of the company that issued 10% interest rate bond. So that company, in the example that I gave you, the first example, the company has issued a 10% interest rate bond, right? And then the interest rate drops to 1%. Then what happened? The price of the bond increased, right? And in the second scenario, the interest rate increased, so the bond price dropped, right? So there's a negative relationship between them.